am Larry Goldman, the Executive Director of the Consortium. I'm pleased to welcome all of you and like to keep you alerted to announcements that are in your folders, an upcoming website that will soon be with us, a new logo that shapes and defines that website, and celebrates not only our unity in faith, but our task to continue dialogue and learning, not only for the sake of unity in Christ, for the sake of building bridges with those of other faiths. We have a special opportunity this evening. I'm going to ask both our speaker and our responder to come join me as I introduce our speaker. I'm personally delighted that our speaker is with us today to share his vast experience and his own acute insight and analytical abilities in shaping the conversation around theology and public life here in the States, especially. We welcome Dr. Gary Dorian, the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary in New York. He graduated summa cum laude from a once Presbyterian, I guess still somewhat Presbyterian school of Alma College. If you go back a ways, he says. His MDiv from Union Theological Seminary, 2 masters from Princeton Theological Seminary, a PhD from Union Graduate School, in addition to other doctorates and honorary degrees. He is an Episcopal priest, an avid athlete, has a daughter, is it Sarah? I just finished theological studies at Columbia Theological Seminary. If you know a good post, let us know. Professor Dorian is the author of many, many books, over 250 articles, and the breadth of this individual's capacity for moving from historical theology into social ethics, theology and public life, social theory, on and on, is quite astounding. He has written on theological liberalism, on evangelicalism, theology and the common good, and even Hegel and Obama, as you will hear. His work in 2 different books. It's not the same book. That would be interesting. Hegel and Obama. That hasn't been tried yet on the Lindbeck show, has it? Sorry. His work, The Making of Modern Theology, the Theological Mind, The Making of the Modern Theological Mind, is acclaimed by dozens of reviewers as the definitive work on this topic. He has written numerous other books. Currently, he is engaged in a project exploring the Black social gospel, a very important, significant piece of history that will be reclaimed. And he just recently had published 2 significant books, one on the idealistic logic of modern theology, which traces Hegelian and post-Kantian influences on modern religious thought, and then secondly, the Obama question, which makes a progressive critique of and defense of Barack Obama's presidency. Dr. Dorian is sought in academic and social justice circles throughout the country. We are delighted to have him with us. Please welcome him.
All right, well, good afternoon, friends. It's a great delight for me to be here today to address this really extraordinary gathering of colleagues and friends. I'm very grateful to Larry and to Sean and anyone who had anything to do with inviting me here, and for the wonderful hospitality it's been extended to me since last night. And even just a moment ago, as he's running through all those books and so on, I had a moment there. I remembered some advice that a friend of mine, Dan McGuire, gave me years ago. Dan, as some of you know, is a very prominent Roman Catholic, white liberal social ethicist. And he once said to me, Gary, if you're ever finding yourself feeling mildly depressed, just feeling that your life isn't amounting to much of anything, just find a way to get yourself introduced. You know, it's working for me. So thank you for that. You know, I did consider for a moment giving one of those, you know, nice kind of innocuous, all things to all people kind of talks about ecumenism here. But then I thought, no, they didn't invite me to do that, to give that talk. So I'm going to go right straight for the talk for the subject of economic justice and the involvement of Christian communities and struggles for it. And I'm going to begin by saying something about the tradition of ecumenical social ethics that many of us in this room share. The idea that our faith calls us to create a just society is as old as the biblical message of letting justice flow like a river, and pouring yourself out for the poor and vulnerable, and attending to what Jesus called the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy. Throughout Christian history, the church has given rise to movements that witness against war and slavery, exclusion, and other social evils. But modern social Christianity introduced something new by virtue of its distinctly modern social consciousness. In the 1880s, proponents of what came to be called the social gospel invented the field that I teach, social ethics, and the first institutions of the ecumenical movement. It was not a coincidence that the social gospel, social ethics, sociology, socialism, and the very ideas of social structure, social salvation, and social justice all arose at the same time. Also corporate capitalism and the trade unions. For the social gospel was essentially a North American version of the movements for Christian socialism that arose in England, Germany, Switzerland, and elsewhere in the late 19th century. It was based on a doctrine of social salvation, which was based on the emerging sociological idea of social structure, which gave rise to the idea of social justice. The key to the social gospel was its novel claim that Christianity has a mission to transform the structures of society in the direction of what was now being called social justice. Early Christianity had a regenerative social ethic, but the early church was a marginalized eschatological community. The medieval church had a social ethic of the common good, but it was also an ethic of authority and social control. Calvinism had a covenantal social ethic, but it was turned into an apologetic for commercial society. Max Weber and all that. The Anabaptist churches had a nonconformist social ethic of usually pacifist dissent, but the Anabaptists were ascetic, or apocalyptic, or sometimes both. Evangelicalism had a roaring post-millennial social ethic that fought against slavery and alcohol, but it fixated on personal conversion. Only with the rise of what came to be called the social gospel did the churches proclaim a theology of social salvation. In the social gospel, society itself became a subject of redemption. Social justice became intrinsic to salvation. Until the modern era, nobody knew there was such a thing as social structure. Upon seeing it, redemption had to be reconceptualized to take account of it. Salvation had to be personal and social to be saved. The social gospel happened for a confluence of reasons that impacted each other, fed by 18th century Enlightenment humanism and the 19th century home missions movement and the ongoing witness of the abolitionist movements. It took root as a response to the corruption of the Gilded Age and the rise of industrial society. It took inspiration from the Christian socialist movement in England, which was mostly Anglican. It rode on the back of a rising sociological consciousness and literature. But above all, the social gospel was a response to a burgeoning labor movement. Trade unionists blasted the churches for doing nothing for poor and working class people. Christian leaders realized it was pointless to defend Christianity if the churches took an indefensible attitude on that issue. There were about 17 things wrong with the social gospel movement, beginning with the fact that most of it was moralistic, idealistic, and not very brave about racial justice. Reinhold Niebuhr got to be famous by blasting the shortcomings of the social gospel, which of course he grew out of, although he had major shortcomings of his own. We have paid a steep price for the fact that modern Christianity as a whole failed to interrogate white supremacism as a structure of power based on privilege that presumes to define what is normal. But for all the things the social gospel got wrong, it got some crucial things right. It recovered the centrality of the kingdom of God in the teaching of Jesus. It taught that Christianity has a mission to transform the structures of society in the direction of social justice. It created the ecumenical movement in this country. It was the wellspring of the civil rights movement through the ministries of Reverdy Ransom, Benjamin Mays, Ida Wells Barnett, Alexander Walters, and then Martin Luther King Jr. For decades, the social gospel was a mostly Protestant enterprise in this country, but John Ryan planted the seeds of a Catholic social gospel that became a movement in the 1920s. Ryan was fond of complaining, in his puckish way, "I'm surrounded by Protestants with a superior attitude." With the founders of social Christianity, Washington Gladden, W.T.P. Bliss, Walter Rauschenbusch, Reverdy Ransom, Vida Scudder, John Ryan, the church began to say that if people suffer because of politics and economics, then the church has to deal with politics and economics, and it has to do so by changing unjust social structures. The social gospel expounded a vision of economic democracy that is as relevant and necessary today as it was a century ago. That's my thesis today. There were many different theologies, ecclesiologies, and political ideologies in the social gospel movement, but all of them took for granted that there had to be a stage beyond unfettered capitalism. A great deal of ecumenical social ethics has backed away from its origin as a movement for economic democracy, but at its best, it has kept faith with the founders. The social gospel was a response to the story of its time and a call for economic democracy and the common good. The story of our time is that the common good has been getting hammered for 30 years, and we need economic democracy more than ever. Global capitalism commodifies everything it touches, including labor and nature, putting everything up for sale and at risk. Nothing is exempt from the pressure of competition. Social contracts have vanished under threats of obsolescence and ruin, while the global market exploits resources, displaces communities, and sets off wealth explosions in wild cycles of boom and bust. The debates that we are having today about busting public unions, cutting Medicaid, and privatizing Medicare are byproducts of 30 years of economic globalization and of massive, structural, to a great degree, politically engineered inequality. Wages have been flat for 35 years and inequality has worsened dramatically. The share of America's income held by the top 1% has more than doubled since 1982. Today, the top 1% of the U.S. population holds 39% of the nation's wealth and takes in 25% of its annual income. The top 10% holds 70% of the wealth. The bottom 50% hold 2%. The crash of 2008 wiped out $8 trillion of home value. The banks that frothed it up are sitting on about $2 trillion of cash. They salted away their bailouts and went back to making gambles in the swaps market, which pays much better than making boring investments in the real economy. Wall Street has recovered very nicely, but we have 8.1 official unemployment and upwards of 20% real unemployment, with even higher figures in African American communities. Every trade deal that we've signed has resulted in jobs leaving the United States. The corporate executive is said to be a great success if he slashes his payroll and eliminates benefits, makes higher profits. But what kind of success is that? For 20 years, the best-selling books about economic globalization told us to just forget about changing the system. Tom Friedman, a celebrant of the second wave, calls it turbo-capitalism. In In the academy, of course, we call it neoliberalism. Economic globalization, the integration of national economies into the global economy through trade, direct foreign investment, short-term capital flows, and flows of labor and technology has flattened the world. Friedman says, in a flat world, you either compete successfully or you're run over. According to neoliberals, global capitalism reduces national politics to just minor tweaks. There's no third way in political economy anymore. There isn't even a second way. Any nation that wants a growing economy has to wear a one-size-fits-all golden straitjacket that unleashes the private sector, minimizes government, eliminates tariffs, deregulates capital markets, and allows direct foreign ownership and control. But neoliberals exaggerate the futility of attempts to channel economic forces. Contrary to the story they tell, the U.S. did not ensure its prosperity by donning the golden straitjacket and relinquishing its manufacturing base. From the late 40s to 1975, productivity and wages in this country simply soared together, creating a middle-class society. Meanwhile, there were no bank crises, as New Deal reforms kept commercial banks out of the investment business. But wages flattened in the mid-70s and productivity just kept soaring. The rich got richer in the 80s and 90s while everybody else fell behind, taking on debt to keep from drowning. During this period, nearly every manufacturing-oriented society in the world outperformed the U.S. in income growth and did so with much more equitable distributions of income. In the 1980s, we cut the marginal tax rate from 70% to 28%, and we cut the capital gains rate from 45% to 20%. That was a revolution, a blowout for politically engineered inequality. Then the global integration of two radically different models of growth, debt-financed consumption and production-oriented exported and saving, created a wildly unstable world economy featuring asset bubbles and huge trade imbalances. First, we hollowed out the industrial base that paid decent wages, providing incentives to firms that made things to make them elsewhere. Then we rang up enormous trade deficits that left us dependent on China and Japan to finance our debt. Then the economy cratered after the debt resort reached its outer limit in the housing market, the mortgage bubble burst. For 20 years, we were told that governments are just passé in this area. But when the housing market crashed, these same supposedly obsolete governments coughed up $12 trillion in 2 months to save the system from itself. It started with people who were just trying to buy a house of their own, who had no concept of predatory lending, and who had no say whatsoever in the securitization boondoggle that spliced up various components of risk in order to trade them separately. It seemed a blessing to get a low-rate mortgage. It was a mystery how the banks did it, but you trusted that they knew what they were doing. This was their business. Your bank sold the mortgage to an aggregator who bunched it up with thousands of other subprime mortgages, chopped the package into pieces, and sold them as corporate bonds. Securitizations and derivatives are great at concocting extra yield, and especially at allowing the banks to hide their debt. Broadly speaking, a derivative is any contract that derives its value from another underlying asset. But more narrowly, it's an instrument that allows investors to speculate on the future price of something without having to buy it. Today, speculators are driving up the price of oil because the Middle East could explode if Iran is attacked, and there's a gusher of money to be made if you make the right bet. Credit default swaps are private contracts that allow investors to bet on whether a borrower is going to default. 12 years ago, that market was $150 billion. Today, it's $70 trillion. And that's the heart of the meltdown right there. AIG's derivatives unit was just a huge casino selling phantom insurance with hardly any backing that now the rest of us have to pay for. Speculators gamed the system and regulators looked the other way. Mortgage brokers, bond bundlers, rating agencies, and corporate executives all made fortunes selling bad mortgages, packaging the loans into securities, handing out inflated bond ratings, putting the bonds on balance sheets. Banks got leveraged up to 50 to 1 and just kept piling on debt. The mania for extra yield fed on itself, blowing away business ethics and even just common sense. This year, speculative corporate debt in this country is soaring, as the reckoning for high-risk loans, bonds, and leveraged buyouts transacted 5 to 7 years ago is occurring. In the bond business, this is called a maturity wall. Last year, over $40 billion came due for junk bonds that were sold before the credit crisis hit in 2007. This year, that number will soar to $170 billion. Next year, it will be over $230 billion. The year after that, it will be over $350 billion. This coming avalanche of over $750 billion of speculative debt was created just like the mortgage crisis, with CDOs that sliced and diced corporate loans, and all of it is coming due at the very time when, as we all surely know by now, the U.S. is going to have to borrow another $2 trillion just to cover its own deficit. Another credit crunch is coming. And today, the entire European Union is teetering on a systemic collapse. In this country, the big banks are still holding about $2 trillion of toxic debt. But their bailouts have made them feel better. Their profits are up. They fought every reform in the Dodd-Frank bill, and now they're spending about $50 million per quarter to obliterate the reforms that did pass. Today, 7 banks control 73% of the nation's assets. 15 years ago, that figure was 18%. That's the path we are on. A staggering concentration of power that has turned the big banks into hedge funds, and it's why I risk what it takes to get up here and give a talk like this. I just think in places like this, we have to talk about this. 2 years ago, we had a chance to break up the big banks. The Brown-Kaufman amendment to the Dodd-Frank bill would have allowed no bank to risk more than 3% of the nation's GDP or hold more than 10% of the nation's total insured deposits. In the Senate, this amendment won 30 Democratic votes and 3 Republican votes, despite failing to win the support of the Obama administration or the Senate Democratic leadership. Brown-Kaufman would have passed had President Obama supported it. He opposed it because he believed that the Volcker Rule was a better way to restrain the speculative excesses of the banks. It didn't help that the person who cut the bailout deals and arranged the recent bank mergers was his own Treasury Secretary. But then we didn't get the Volcker Rule either. In 1999, the Clinton administration teamed with Bill Graham to tear down the Glass-Steagall wall between commercial and investment banking, which opened the door to everything I've just been talking about. All these mega banker mergers, and all of it comes out of that piece of legislation. So, yes, it was a big deal when Obama announced that he supported Paul Volcker's proposal to reinstate the wall between commercial and investment banking. The federal government provides deposit insurance and other safeguards to ensure that we have a stable banking system. These privileges were not created to give unfair advantages to banks operating hedge funds or private equity funds. Banks should not be allowed to speculate with cheap money that the government safety net itself provides. The current system allows banks to make trades conflicting with the interests of their own customers, which has fueled a riot of speculation. The ostensible purpose of Wall Street is to raise money to finance making things in the real economy. But CDO deals are not investments. They don't create any actual bonds or mortgages. They don't add anything of value to society. They are pure gambling on whether somebody else's bonds will succeed. They're like side bets at a casino, except the Federal Reserve implicitly protects these bets. According to the SEC, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, and other firms have looted their own customers by creating derivatives that are designed to fail and then betting against them. rule was designed to put a stop to that. This was not mere technocratic tinkering. This was using political power to change the system. But in the end, to pass the Dodd-Frank bill, the Volcker Rule was gutted with exemptions for trading in treasury bonds and bonds issued by government-backed entities. As always, these exemptions led to others, and today the Volcker Rule is just shot full of holes. Volcker's proposal was 3 pages long. The version that got through the Dodd-Frank bill was 10 pages. Today it's over 300 pages. Just a monument to the power of Wall Street lobbying. There are some good things in the Dodd-Frank bill. It requires most derivatives to be traded on a public exchange and cleared through a third party. It established a new consumer agency and authorized regulators to impose higher capital reserves. These were very significant victories against an overwhelmingly better funded opposition. But Dodd-Frank is riddled with poison pills and loopholes, especially exemptions for foreign exchange swaps and pension funds, carve-outs for corporate users of derivatives. It relies very heavily on the Fed, which is, of course, friendly to the big banks. Dodd-Frank does not require higher capital reserves. It does not abolish gambling with CDOs, and it takes its biggest pass on the biggest problem of all, that the too big to fail banks are also too big to be regulated. Simon Johnson, until 4 years ago, was chief economist of the International Monetary Fund. He argues that the finance industry has effectively captured our government. During his early career at MIT, he tried to be skeptical about this, but then he went to the IMF and he got a close look at the symbiotic relationships between the world's economic elites and its governments. In the US, he says, it goes way beyond mere access or even collusion. In this country, the two career tracks of government and high finance are simply melded together. And that is problematic when the oligarchy screws up and the economy implodes. When the IMF enters the scene of a crash, the economic part is usually pretty straightforward. Nations in crisis are told to live within their means by increasing exports, cutting imports, and breaking up bankrupt enterprises and banks. Every nation in the world that is not the USA would get that prescription. But the US controls the IMF. It has a powerful and well-connected oligarchy, and it pays its foreign debts in its own currency. So our recovery began by paying off Wall Street. Our president was co-opted on that one before he began, by rounding up Democratic support for the Paulson Plan. South Korea and Indonesia had crashes in 1997. Malaysia had one in 1998. Russia and Argentina both had more than one. And then came the meltdown of 2008. In every case, the financial oligarchy rigged the game in its favor, built an empire on debt, overreached in good times, and brought the house down on everybody. When the house implodes, elites do what they always do. They take care of their own. To get a different result, a nation has to take control of the problem and break the grip of the oligarchy. Otherwise, you just muddle along in a lost decade of your own, which further entrenches the oligarchy. The usual IMF playbook is pretty clear. Find a bottom, clear out the clutter, get the fiscal and monetary houses in order, and if possible, shake up crony capitalism. Johnson says, well, you know, there's always going to be an oligarchy, so the best thing we can do is just shake it up from time to time. To this end, he recommends new antitrust laws, although we can't say what they look like. And he says it's pointless to try to cap executive compensation because they always find a way. So in his new book, 13 Bankers, he makes, I think, a very compelling case for shrinking the big banks. If we take the existing system for granted, that prescription is about the best we can do. But I think we need to be talking about something much bolder and more creative than the IMF playbook, something the social gospelers were onto a century ago, renewing this country with massive investments in economic democracy. For over 2 centuries, Americans have debated two fundamentally different visions of what kind of country we should want to be. One is the vision of a society that provides unrestricted liberty to acquire wealth. The other is the vision of a realized democracy in which rights over society's major institutions are established. In the first view, the right to property is lifted above the right to self-government, and the just society minimizes the equalizing role of government. In the second view, self-government is considered superior to property, and the just society places democratic checks on social, political, and economic power. In the first vision, the goal is to attain enough success to stand apart from other people and maybe not have to worry about them, and perhaps to look down on them. In the second vision, a just society reduces the punishments of failure and the rewards of success. Both of these visions are ideal types, deeply rooted in U.S. American history. Both have limited and conditioned each other throughout the U.S. experience. But in every generation, one of them does gain predominance over the other, shaping the terms of debate and possibility, telling the decisive story of its time. Today, an extreme version of the first American vision is being asserted very aggressively. The story of our time, in this view, is that a great people is being throttled by a voracious federal government. In the past 6 months, I've done over 140 radio and television shows, and I've gotten a steady diet of this worldview. Americans are overtaxed. Government is always the problem. Somehow the federal government caused the financial crash. We have a debt crisis because we have too much government, and cutting taxes at the upper end is always in order. The Tea Party movement exploded into being by claiming that the Keynesian stimulus of 2009 was anti-American and socialist. We had lost 4 million jobs the year before. We lost 741,000 just in the month that Obama was inaugurated. The economy was free-falling into a depression. But somehow it was horribly wrong to save the nation from reliving 1933. On the basis of that absurd position, every House Republican voted against the stimulus, and the Tea Party movement was born that month. Then it won a tremendous political windfall by compounding the absurdity which has yielded the spectacle of hostage politics. The stimulus bill contained the most important anti-poverty measure since the Johnson administration, expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit. We need to know that today over 8 million people are not in poverty simply because of that single legislative achievement, period. But the president got it through by quietly wedging it through, which is one reason that hardly anybody knows about this. He feared that if he made a big deal about it, about helping people who lack lobbying power, Congress would vote against it. Then he pulled off a colossal anti-poverty reform by obtaining health coverage for 34 million uninsured people, which immediately became politically toxic. I believe that the president made serious mistakes in the way he went about health care reform. He excluded single payer as something we couldn't even talk about, and he bailed out on the public option without risking a single speech or fight for it. But for all that he got wrong in this area, and all that we can talk about in this area, it does say something terribly important about him as a moral being, that he risked his presidency to gain health coverage for tens of millions of poor and vulnerable people. The Tea Party thrives on a deeply felt dichotomy between the deserving and the undeserving. It is driven primarily by its rage against the supposedly undeserving and the liberal elites who are said to coddle the undeserving. This movement is overwhelmingly white, middle class, and either middle-aged or elderly. At the grassroots level, much of this movement is not hostile to Social Security or Medicare, unlike the professional ideologues who are exploiting it. Conservative activists are quite certain that they deserve their own Social Security and Medicare. But they are outraged that undeserving people get benefits from the government and they resent losing their racial privileges. In their version of the American dream, there is no such thing as the common good. There is only the sum of individual goods, which many people do not deserve. The Tea Party, a new phenomenon, rests on resentments and an ideology that are far from new in U.S. American life. But this ideology, a throwback to social Darwinism, has no standing whatsoever in the tradition of social ethics upheld by the ecumenical Christian churches in this country, which is why I am daring this risk speaking about it so plainly today. Here we begin with the recognition that we owe obligations to each other, that the Bible teaches a preferential option for the poor and depressed, and that there is such a thing as the common good. When the sum of individual goods is organized only by a capitalist economy, it produces a common bad that destroys personal goods along with society. I have 4 points to make about that. 1, Americans are not overtaxed. This year, the total tax burden reached its lowest point since 1958. In 1999, Americans spent 28% of their income on federal, state, and local taxes, which was the usual amount going back to the early 1970s. Today, that figure is 23%. As a percentage of GDP, American taxation is at its lowest level today since 1950, 14.8%. 2, this is precisely how we got in debt. If we had stuck with the Clinton tax rates, our national debt today would be minimal or non-existent. Our nation's debt exploded because during the Bush years, we cut the marginal rate in capital gains without paying for either. We established a drug benefit that we didn't pay for, the first entitlement in American history, lacking a pay for, and we fought 2 wars that we didn't bother to pay for. These expenditures doubled the nation's debt in 7 years, and that record simply keeps mounting, accounting for over 3/4 of the debt accumulated on Obama's watch. Most of the remaining new debt is just cleanup for the financial crash. Today, wealthy Americans pay income taxes at the capital gains rate, 15%. Investment managers earning billions per year are allowed to classify their income as carried interest, which is taxed at the capital gains rate. Constantly, we are told that the investor class would lose its zeal for making money if it had to pay taxes on its actual income, or if the capital gains rate were decreased. But there's just no evidence for that at all, not whatsoever. No investor passes on a promising investment because of the tax rate on a potential gain. A tax system that serves the common good would have additional brackets for the highest incomes, as the U.S. long did. It'd have a bracket for $1 million earners, and a bracket for $10 million earners, and another bracket for $100 million earners. It would lift the cap on the regressive Social Security tax, taxing salaries above $110,000 per year. It's just absurd that somebody making $1 million per year pays no more into Social Security than somebody making $110,000. Reforming Medicare is going to be difficult and complex, because Medicare is a four-sided contraption of political compromises, all of it resting on fee-for-service medicine. But Social Security is simple. A minimal, decent adjustment would fix it. 3, a federal budget is a moral document. If we scaled back America's global military empire and reinstated a progressive tax system, we could eliminate the federal debt by 2021 without cutting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education, or research. A morally decent tax and budget plan would tax capital gains as ordinary income. It would cap the benefit and itemized deductions about 28%. It would tax U.S. foreign income as it's earned. It would eliminate the subsidies for oil, gas, and coal companies. It would place a tax on credit default swaps and futures and charge a leverage tax on the mega banks. These are not radical proposals, not any of them nor all of them together. We would still be way below European levels of taxation if we did all of this. All of it merely, mildly restores the principle that people should pay taxes on the basis of their ability to do so. 4, tax rates are not the most important factor contributing to economic growth anyway. Creating a healthy and productive workforce is far more important than the fluctuations in tax rates that we debate in election years. Educating the workforce for 21st century jobs and investing in research and technology are much more important. Developing a strong infrastructure and saving for investment are at least as important as tax rates. Today, the economy is sluggish because of weak consumer demand caused by stagnant wages, job uncertainty, and the ongoing ravages of the mortgage disaster. Europe opted for austerity plans, and today nearly every European nation is suffering for it. We're now in the middle of a campaign where one party is calling for a 20% tax cut, which would send the national debt soaring, so that to deal with that, we're going to have to break the social contract on Medicare and Medicaid. The other party is saying, well, we just need to get more revenue from the wealthy and regulate Wall Street. I certainly believe that there is an enormous amount at stake in the differences between those approaches. That's why I wrote the Obama question, and I've spent the past year out speaking on these things. But what I really believe is that this campaign season is barely touching on the enormous problems that we are facing. We need to renew the country by making massive investments in a clean energy economy. Labor costs, equipment costs, and the cost of capital will never be lower than they are right now. The U.S. has underinvested in infrastructure, education, and technology for decades. A national infrastructure bank could get serious money plowed into infrastructure rebuilding on an ongoing basis. If we can spend trillions of taxpayer dollars bailing out banks and eating the toxic debt of AIG and Citigroup, we ought to be able to create good public banks at the state and federal levels to do good things. Public banks could finance startups and green technology that are currently languishing. They could provide financing for cooperatives that traditional banks earn. They can be financed by an economic stimulus package or by claiming the good assets of banks seized by the government. There are usually 3 or 4 every Friday, or both. Or they can be established at the state level. Today, the only state in this country that isn't reeling from the credit crunch is North Dakota, which happens to be the only state that has its own bank. North Dakota has its own credit machine, which makes it less dependent on Wall Street than the rest of the country. Recently, the state of Washington voted to establish a state bank. And today, there are very significant movements to establish state banks in Massachusetts, Illinois, Michigan, Virginia, Missouri, New Mexico, Vermont, about 15 others. If these movements succeed, that will be an enormous step in the direction of economic democracy, the biggest that we have seen in the past century. Economic democracy is about extending the values and rights of democracy into the economic sphere. It features mixed forms of worker, community, mutual fund, or public bank enterprises. I don't believe that the factors of production trump everything else. That's why I could have done various other talks that had nothing to do with economics, but I think once you deal with economics, you just have to really do it. Because I do believe that those who control the terms, amounts, and direction of credit play an enormous role in determining the kind of society that the rest of us end up living in. People work harder and more efficiently when they have a stake in the company, when it's their company. In Spain, the Mondragon network is spectacularly successful. In this country, we have about 14,000 firms with worker-owned plans, another 1,000 that are fully worker-controlled, and those are building blocks for a movement. But on the way to a serious movement, which I allowed, we don't have yet, economic democracy is about building up institutions that don't belong wholly to the capitalist market or to the state. It begins by expanding the sector of producer and consumer cooperatives, community land trusts, community finance corporations, the very things that Rauschenbusch spent 700 pages talking about in Christianizing the Social Order, 1912. Credit unions play a key role. Credit unions are growing. One of the best things that Occupy did was to encourage people to join credit unions. But merely expanding the cooperative sector is not enough. Cooperatives usually prohibit non-working shareholders, so they attract less outside financing than capitalist firms. They're committed to keeping low-return firms in operation, so they tend to stay in business even when they can't pay competitive wages. They're committed to particular communities, so they're less mobile than corporate capital and labor. They smack of anti-capitalist bias, so they have trouble getting financing from banks. They maximize net income per worker rather than profits, so they tend to favor capital-intensive investments over job creation. Most of these problems are virtues, and the problematic aspects can be mitigated with tax incentives. But I think we also need something bolder and more visionary. We need forms of social ownership that facilitate democratic capital formation, that have a greater capacity for scaling up, and that are more entrepreneurial. Which means we need public banks and mutual funded holding companies in which ownership of productive capital is vested. The companies lend capital to enterprises at market rates of interest, and they otherwise control the process of investment. Equity shareholders, the state and/or other cooperatives own the holding companies or the public banks. These models contain a built-in system of wage restraints, and they facilitate new forms of capital formation. They have nothing to do with nationalization. Investors still seek the highest rate of return. This approach does not rest on idealistic ideas about human nature, and it doesn't need a blueprint. I've got favorite models to push, and books out there that deal with my favorite models, but the key thing is to expand the social market in ways that make sense in particular communities. Most of our traditions in social theory and Christian social ethics have operated with unitary ideas about something called capitalism and something else called socialism, as though each were only one thing. Economic democracy has to be built from the ground up, piece by piece, breaking from the universalizing logic of socialism, taking seriously that there are different kinds of capitalism. The tests are pragmatic. The U.S. Pacific Northwest has a network of long-standing, highly successful plywood cooperatives. Some plywood workers choose to work in conventional firms rather than the cooperatives. No political economy worth building would force them into a different choice. But having a real choice is the key to a better alternative. A politics that expanded the cooperative and social ownership sectors would give workers important new choices. The central conceit of neoclassical economics could be turned into a reality if meaningful choices were created. The textbook conceit is that capitalism doesn't exploit anybody, because labor employs capital as much as capital employs labor. But in the real world, the owners of capital nearly always organize the factors of production. To expand the cooperative and other social market sectors would give choices to workers that neoclassical textbook theory promises, but does not deliver. It would show that there is an alternative to a system that stokes and celebrates greed and consumption to the point of self-destruction. The Earth's ecosystem cannot sustain a US-American level lifestyle for more than 1/5 of the world's population. The economy is physical. There are limits to economic growth. Global warming is melting the Arctic ice cap at a shocking pace, destroying wetlands around the world. There is no legitimate argument against a government-sanctioned green GDP that reflects the depletion of our natural resources and the degradation of our environment. But after 30 years of talking about it, the federal government still does not have metrics for sustainability because the coal and oil companies don't want to be charged for the costs that they impose on the environment. Charles Kindleberger, in his major work, World Economic Policy, 1500 to 1990, described the rise and fall of the great economic powers of the modern world. The chief internal causes of decline that he identified were increased consumption, decreased savings, resistance to taxation, corruption, mounting debt, finance becoming more dominant in the economy than industry, and, above all, military overreach. Sound familiar? 40 years ago, Senator William Fulbright warned that the U.S. was well on its way to becoming an empire that exercised power for its own sake, projected to the limit of its capacity and beyond, filling every vacuum and extending U.S. force to the farthest reaches of the earth. As the power grows, he warned, it becomes an end in itself, separated from its initial motives, all the while denying it, governed by its own mystique, projecting power merely because we have it. These eerie warnings have come to pass, undeniably, in our time. For those of us who belong to a faith tradition, having a faith keeps us in the struggle against empire and for social justice. In Hebrew and Christian scripture, the test of ethical action is how it affects the struggles of oppressed and excluded people. I am for almost anything that helps our beleaguered seminaries and religious congregations and other communities of moral memory hold on against a dominant culture that denigrates the poor and vulnerable. And I am for anything that helps us creatively refashion our religious institutions for a global, interdependent, interfaith world. We need to uphold the best of our traditions of social Christianity, ecumenism, and the numerous liberation and ecumenical theologies, and we need to do it in a way that's global, that's connected to world cultures and societies, and engaged in interreligious dialogue. Our faith traditions are not relevant in the sense of teaching a theory of politics or economics. Jesus didn't talk about the things that we talk about in social ethics. Problems of proximate means and ends, theories of justice, calculated consequences, defending structures of justice. But the teaching of Jesus compels us into struggles for social justice and holds us there, whether or not we succeed. That is its deepest social relevance. To love God above all things and your neighbor as yourself is the motive force of the struggle for the flourishing of life. The ethic of Jesus, the love ethic of Jesus, makes you care, makes you angry, throws you into the struggle, keeps you in it, helps you face another day. It helps you hold and view the big picture, the kingdom of God, which is not our production. The kingdom or commonwealth of God is comprehensive and multidimensional. It is the heavenly realm and the divine spirit that enlivens every human soul, and the building of a commonwealth or a kingdom on earth, and the eschatological not yet that pulls us into the future and toward the end of history. The kingdom of God is something in which we have a tiny, partial, wonderful, mostly unheralded, sometimes painful, always grace-filled role to play. We're not in control. It's not up to us to fulfill God's will for the world. In drawing closer to God, we're thrown into work that allows others to share in the harvest. And that's enough. Nobody can say if our efforts will succeed or make a difference, which is all right. But the biblical imperative to pour yourself out for the hungry and satisfy the desires of the afflicted is utterly certain. After our struggles have ended, it is the ever-gracious God of glory and love who will make something of them. The idea of a good society or common good emerges from discussion, and it's always in process of revision. We never have it in our hand or control it. To let go of the idea of it, of the struggle for it, though, whether we let go of it for Niebuhrian reasons or deconstructivist reasons or any reason at all, is to undercut the struggle for attainable gains toward social justice, negating the elusive but formative vision of what it is that's worth struggling for. without a vision of a good society that transcends the prevailing order, ethics and politics remain captive to the dominant order, restricted to marginal reforms. The borders of possibility remain untested. We need new forms of community that forge ties of trust and solidarity across our divisions of race, ethnicity, class, religion, nationality, sexual orientation. If those of us who are Caucasian, or mostly Caucasian, fail to interrogate white supremacism, we will resist any recognition of our own racism. If those of us who are male fail to interrogate our complicity in sexism, we will perpetuate it. If those of us who are Christian fail to repudiate anti-Semitism and Christian exclusivism, we will perpetuate the evils that come with them. If those of us who are heterosexual fail to stand up for the rights of LGBTQ individuals and communities, we will have an oppressive society and church. And if we swear our highest loyalty to our nation, we will perpetuate U.S. American imperialism. A century ago, the Federal Council of Churches issued an historic social creed that emphasized the rights of workers and the abolition of poverty. That first social creed was straight out of the social gospel movement. Today, the National Council of Churches has a new creed. It calls for full civil, political, and economic rights for women and men of all races. It demands the abolition of forced labor, human trafficking, and the exploitation of children. It supports employment for all at a family-sustaining living wage with equal pay for comparable work. It stands up for the right of workers to organize. It opposes the death penalty. It calls for the abatement of hunger and poverty, and endorses universal health care, Social Security, and progressive tax policies. It commends immigration policies that protect family unity and foster international cooperation. It stresses the necessity of adopting simpler lifestyles, living within our means, protecting the Earth's environment, and investing in renewable energy. It supports equitable global trade that protects local economies and advocates a foreign policy based on international law and multilateral diplomacy. It calls for nuclear disarmament, reductions in military spending, and the abolition of torture. It calls for cooperation and dialogue among world religions. There are 34 denominations in the National Council of Churches. It is no easy thing to get our religious communities to stand behind a statement like the one I just summarized. Every line of the new social creed has a story behind it. To hang in there against the national myth that opposes the common good and a financial oligarchy that is the most powerful force in our nation's life, one has to have a certain stubbornness and moral outrage. And I think it helps, I tell this to college students all over the country, I think it helps to have a spiritual wellspring. May we all of us, have all three in ample measure.